Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin.
And let's begin. Miss Marple had always believed that the most unsettling cries were not those of anguish, but those wrapped in confusion. Such was the cry that came drifting over the hedge one sunlit Thursday morning in early April, just as she was tending her rose bushes behind the white trellis gate. The breeze carried the scent of tilled earth and the lilac bloom from Mrs. Griffin's garden. And then, quite distinctly, came the sound, a gasp, a strangled sob, followed by hurried footsteps on gravel. She rose slowly, brushing a petal from her sleeve, and stepped to the front path. There, in the lane, stood Mrs. Penfold, flushed, disoriented, the sort of woman who seldom left the house without her gloves, and now had one missing. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, as though the words had been waiting behind her teeth. "Oh, I do beg your pardon, but you're the only one who will understand. I found something in Ivy's things, something terribly wrong." Miss Marple did not interrupt. She merely nodded, guiding her gently by the elbow toward the garden bench, where the kettle had not yet cooled. "Now then," she said, "take your time." Mrs. Penfold's voice trembled as she recounted the find. It was a biscuit tin, round blue enamel, with painted violets, and a lid that no longer fit quite right. She had come upon it while clearing the upper cupboard in the back room of Rosewood Cottage, where her late mother-in-law, Miss Ivy Penfold, had once kept linens and photographs. Inside, beneath old lace and brittle postcards, she had discovered a folded handkerchief, its corner stained with something dark, and something else, a single silver button, tucked beneath the cloth. Not the sort from ladies' wear, she had said, but stiff and cold, the kind from a child's coat or perhaps a uniform. Mrs. Penfold's hands had shaken, and in that moment she had not known whom to tell. The house had been empty 2 years. Why now? Why hidden? Miss Marple, listening intently, did not ask what Ivy had been hiding, only why it had needed hiding at all. Rosewood Cottage sat quietly behind the bakehouse, its shutters painted green, and a lavender bush drooping along the path. Since Ivy Penfold's passing, it had stood mostly unused, a place with too many teacups and too few visitors. The garden remained tidy, as though time had stopped precisely when it ought. Miss Marple had visited often in Ivy's last years. She remembered a woman fond of propriety, who served sponge cake with a fork, and had once, half laughing, half earnest, called secrets a necessary part of civilized life. And yet the biscuit tin, so feminine, so harmless, had become a vessel for something else entirely. That it had sat undisturbed through seasons and sales, and only now emerged, struck Miss Marple not as coincidence, but as consequence. For in St. Hermès Hollow, things tended to reappear not when searched for, but when they were ready to be seen. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Penfold's invitation to tea. She arrived with a small bouquet of forget-me-nots, and sat quietly at the table where Henry Penfold, the village baker, poured weak tea, and offered no comment on the biscuit tin that now rested, closed, on the sideboard. Seated opposite him was his younger brother Thomas, recently returned from London. His presence was unexpected, his expression unreadable. He declined the scones and kept his fingers laced on the table, except when they twitched, almost imperceptibly, at mention of Ivy's name. "Funny old thing," Henry said finally, his tone light. "Kept everything. Couldn't throw out a jam jar without a fuss." Mrs. Penfold attempted a smile. She believed in keeping the past close. Thomas looked up then sharply, as if a line had been crossed. Some things are better left buried. Miss Marple noted the silence that followed. Not the silence of agreement, but the silence of people waiting for someone else to say more. She stirred her tea but made no reply. It was not her habit to force such moments. They always spoke again. Eventually. Later, when the others had stepped into the garden, Miss Marple remained indoors and, with the casual quiet of one long accustomed to invisibility, stepped nearer to the biscuit tin. The button had been placed in a small envelope. She studied it carefully, silver, smooth-edged, and bearing a faint, almost erased crest. Too polished for women's wear, too small for standard military issue, and yet unmistakably familiar. A child's uniform, perhaps. She folded the envelope gently and replaced it. The most telling clues she had found were rarely the loudest. They were the ones out of place and unwilling to explain themselves. As evening fell and the wind lifted the lace curtains at her sitting-room window, Miss Marple sipped her chamomile tea and let her thoughts wander, as they often did, to things unsaid. She had seen that sort of button before, during the war, when children played soldiers and dressed up in donated coats. And she remembered Ivy Penfold's fierce loyalty to silence, her need to control not only what was remembered, but what was allowed to be. It was not the blood that unsettled Miss Marple. It was the silence, the kind that grows thickest in the absence of truth. The following Saturday brought the annual Saint-Hermes Hollow Spring Fete, held in the churchyard beneath bunting strung between the yew trees and trestle tables lined with sponge cakes and apricot jam. The air was sweet with marzipan and daffodils, but beneath the pleasant hum of village chatter ran a sharper, murmuring undercurrent. Miss Marple, seated near the jam-judging tent with a modest scone and a cup of rather weak tea, listened with mild interest to the conversation unfurling like ivy along the benches. The subject, spoken in lower tones and abrupt pauses, was the biscuit tin, or rather, what had been in it. "She said it was blood," whispered Mrs. Abernathy to her sister, her mouth barely moving. "Could have been beetroot," her sister replied too loudly. "Oh no," interjected Mrs. Ridgewell, eyes gleaming. "Old Ivy was never right after the war. They say she saw things, heard voices." From across the table, Mr. Finch, the retired schoolmaster, snorted quietly into his teacup. More likely she kept something back. Ivy was a woman who liked having the last word, even if it took 2 years after her death. Miss Marple, silent as always, stirred her tea. She knew well that gossip in a village had less to do with truth than with shape. It was a way of making sense of what people feared to understand. Mrs. Goodbody, resplendent in a mauve hat that had once graced the Women's Institute newsletter, had made herself the unofficial keeper of village memory. And on this day, her voice rose with theatrical relish, just as the sponge judging concluded. "I always said Ivy had secrets," she declared, adjusting her brooch with finality. "There was that incident with the jam jars. Do you remember? Labeled one thing, filled with another. I told the vicar's wife it wasn't just forgetfulness. She liked confusing people. And always so odd about her back room," she continued, lowering her voice now. "No one ever went in. Curtains drawn. I once offered to help with a sewing circle there, and she made up some nonsense about moths." The listeners leaned in, not for truth but for atmosphere. Mrs. Goodbody took a deep sip of lemon cordial, then added, "And did you know, she once had a child staying with her. A girl, wartime. But no one ever saw her leap." Miss Marple, seated a few feet away, pretending interest in a fruitcake recipe, caught the final remark and filed it away. As always, the truth in such accounts was not in what was remembered, but in what had been forgotten too quickly. After the fete, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage to return a borrowed hymn book. She lingered politely in the hallway as the vicar's wife, a woman fond of gentle recollection and dry sponge, offered tea and a seat by the window. In the soft light, they spoke of inconsequential things, church flowers, roof tiles, and then with the hint of discomfort the conversation curved toward Ivy Penfold. "She had a child staying with her once, didn't she?" Miss Marple asked casually, pouring another half cup of tea. The vicar's wife nodded slowly. "Yes. Ruth, I believe. One of the evacuees from London. Very quiet, thin little thing. Used to sit with her knees drawn up like a sparrow." She paused. "She didn't stay long. Ivy never said why. One morning the girl was simply gone. Sent back, I suppose." Miss Marple waited a beat before replying. "Children don't always leave quietly." "No." The vicar's wife agreed. "But some are forgotten easily enough, aren't they?" They sipped in silence, while the garden beyond them stirred faintly in the breeze. Somewhere behind the tulips and tea, a story had been misplaced, and Miss Marple, with quiet certainty, intended to find where. It was the following Wednesday when the subject of the will came up at the post office, naturally, while waiting for stamps. Miss Marple, collecting a parcel of wool, stood near enough to overhear Mrs. Larch and Mr. Clay discussing the recent repairs at Rosewood Cottage. "You'd think Henry would have done something about the chimney by now," said Mrs. Larch, folding her change. "After all, he was her eldest." "Cottage went to Thomas, didn't it?" Mr. Clay replied, squinting. "Odd, that." "Very odd," she agreed. "Especially after all those years Henry ran the bakery. And Thomas, off in London, never showed his face." Miss Marple, ever polite, offered a gentle interruption. "Perhaps Ivy had her reasons." Mrs. Larch sniffed. "Perhaps. Or perhaps something made her change her mind." The implication hovered, more potent than proof. Inheritance, Miss Marple thought, as she stepped out into the late spring air, had a way of loosening tongues and tightening resentments. If Ivy had left her cottage to the son who had vanished from village life, there had to be more than affection behind the act, especially in a place where sentiment so often masked regret. The children of the village, now the grandchildren of the evacuee generation, often played soldiers on the green. Swords carved from wood, caps inherited from uncles, boots far too large for their feet. It was a scene that Miss Marple passed often, and this week she paused longer than usual. She thought again of the button. Silver, smooth and wrong, not military, not domestic. A thing not matched to any uniform she remembered, and she remembered many. Later that afternoon, over sherry with Miss Hartnell, she mentioned the button in passing. "Could have come from one of those costumes," said Miss Hartnell, pointing with her spoon. "They used to dress them up during the war, didn't they?" "For morale?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, though not many mothers gave their children real buttons. Most stitched felt or used wood. Safer, you see. Miss Hartnell had nothing to add. Miss Marple filed it away. Not a costume piece, then. Not a military badge. Something older, or something repurposed. In this village, she knew, even small objects carried stories, and sometimes the story a button told had less to do with what it fastened, and more to do with what it tried to hold shut. That evening Miss Marple sat with her knitting by the fire, her needles clicking softly, as twilight settled beyond the parlor windows. She thought again of Ivy's biscuit tin, the stain on the cloth, the odd silence that followed every new discovery. Gossip, in St. Hermes Hollow, was a pastime. But like lacework, it was full of holes where the pattern mattered most. She thought of Henry's clenched jaw, of Mrs. Penfold's fixed smile when speaking of her husband's inheritance, of Thomas returning without fanfare, and that quiet flicker in his eyes when the name Ruth was mentioned. Not guilt exactly, not grief. Something thinner stretched tight across memory. Villages, Miss Marple had long observed, held their grudges in layers, like sponge and cream. The sweet softened the bitter, but never erased it. She recalled the fete, the way Mrs. Goodbody had leaned in as though performing, and the absence that had followed her tale of the evacuee girl. No one challenged the story, nor added to it. It had been spoken, then buried beneath seed cake and second-hand embroidery. But something had happened to Ruth, and Ivy, for all her orderly habits and lavender drawers, had known what it was. Enough to hide it, if not enough to forget. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her fingers resting lightly on the wool. Silence, she thought, could be a kindness or a wound. She wondered which one Ivy Penfold had meant it to be. Miss Marple found Thomas Penfold not at Rosewood Cottage, but in the little orchard behind the bakehouse, where the plum trees leaned toward one another like conspirators. He stood beside the shed, smoking slowly, his coat collar turned up despite the mildness of the day. There was a cautious air about him, not nervousness exactly, but the restraint of someone unaccustomed to being watched. "I suppose you've come to ask about the tin," he said without turning, as she approached. "Everyone else has." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I've come to ask about Ivy." He turned then. "Mother." There was a pause, not hostile but heavy. "She loved Henry best," he said finally, with the quiet certainty of old wounds. "Even when she didn't mean to. He was the baker's son, the practical one. I was—" He shrugged. The disappointment. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply listened. "She kept the cottage tidy, but it never felt warm. Not after I was 16. After that, it was all starch and silence." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did something happen?" Thomas's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but memory. "Something always happens, doesn't it?" he replied. "It's just that no one says it aloud." She watched his fingers close around the end of his cigarette, and knew that resentment had a shape, and his had settled into him long ago. They walked a little, side by side, the grass brushing softly against their ankles. "She wasn't cruel," Thomas said, more to himself than to her. "Just precise. Expected things to be put right, and if they weren't, she'd remove herself. Her affection was conditional, on behavior, on quiet, on being useful." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She had known women like Ivy. They gave only what they could control. Thomas stopped near a lichen-covered bench. "We used to be close, you know. I read to her in the evenings. She said I had a good voice. And then—" he hesitated. "There was a girl, Ruth, a child. She stayed with us for a while. After she left, something shifted. Ivy became distant." Miss Marple glanced at him but said nothing. "I asked once why Ruth had gone. Ivy looked at me and said, 'Some things are better unremembered.' After that, I stopped asking." Miss Marple could feel the brittleness in his voice, like paper long folded and finally opened again. The division had not begun with rage, but with omission, and that, she knew, could carve far deeper wounds than anger ever would. Miss Ellison, once the schoolmistress of St. Hermes, now occupied the back room of a cottage behind the vicarage garden, where books still lined the walls, and her voice bore the crisp authority of decades spent with chalk and register. "Oh yes," she said when Miss Marple inquired. I remember the girl, Ruth, a delicate thing, wide-eyed and solemn, always cold even in summer. She stayed with the Penfolds. With Miss Ivy, yes. Odd arrangement, that. Most evacuees were spread about, but Ivy requested her specifically. Said she preferred quiet girls. Miss Marple listened as Miss Ellison pulled names from memory like beads from a box. She rarely spoke, kept her head down. Bright but skittish. Once I found her crying behind the church hall. Wouldn't say why. Was she bullied? No, said Miss Ellison, frowning faintly. The other girls were kind to her. She was afraid of something else, I think. She folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles pale and prominent. And then, one Monday, she were gone. Ivy said she'd gone back to London. No explanation. No farewell. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning. Ruth, it seemed, had not vanished into memory. She had simply been left there, without anchor. The old vicarage archives, though dusty, had preserved more than scripture. Miss Marple, always courteous but never idle, asked the current vicar's wife if she might glance through the wartime registers, ostensibly to locate a hymn sheet, but more truthfully, to locate Ruth. In a slim folder marked, Evacuees, 1943. The name appeared twice. Ruth Marguerite Ellison. Arrived 17th March. Returned 5th April. Only 3 weeks, barely a season. There was no exit record, no explanation. Just a brief pencil note. Child withdrawn. Home circumstances changed. Miss Marple leaned back in a chair. 3 weeks. And somewhere in that narrow span, something had happened. Enough to send Ruth home. Though home in 1943, London meant air raids and uncertainty. No one sent a child back unless the alternative felt worse. She imagined the girl, knees drawn up, fingers curled round a woolen blanket, and no one asking quite the right questions. It was not a crime, Miss Marple reflected, for a child to leave. But it could be a sin to ignore the reason. She returned the folder to its box and gently closed the lid. In Saint-Hermes, stories faded easily, but some left their breath behind on the glass. Mrs. Penfold waited until after supper to speak again of the tin. They sat together in the parlor, the evening fire casting long shadows across the carpet. There was something else, she said softly. In the lining. I didn't tell Henry. I wasn't sure it was meant for him. She drew out a folded envelope, brittle with time. The address, faded but legible, read, My dearest R. Inside was a single page, handwritten, neat and slanted. I haven't read it all, she confessed. It felt too, private. Miss Marple unfolded the letter, her eyes passing slowly over the careful lines. I made a terrible mistake. I told you it wasn't real. I said you had imagined it, because I couldn't bear what it would mean. You were a child, and I was supposed to protect you. I failed. I hope one day you will forgive me. You were right to leave. I should have let you speak. Yours always, Ivy. The letter trembled slightly in Miss Marple's hand. Why was it never sent? Mrs. Penfold whispered. Because, Miss Marple thought, some truths are easier to hide than to admit, especially when silence feels like protection. She folded the letter again, slowly, as one might fold a wound that would not quite close. Miss Marple walked home beneath a pale moon, her steps deliberate, her thoughts arranged like pins in a sewing tray. The letter weighed lightly in her pocket, but heavily on her conscience. She thought of Ivy Penfold, not as the woman who served tea cakes and issued remarks from lace-covered chairs, but as someone who once bore witness to a child's fear and chose silence. Perhaps she had done it out of love, or shame, or fear of scandal. In villages such as Saint-Thermès, a whisper could wound more cruelly than any knife. She passed the green where laughter from the public house drifted faintly across the road, and paused by the old post-box, now rusted and unused. Her letter never posted. A child never asked again. Her wound bandaged in silence, but never healed. Miss Marple had seen many kinds of cruelty, some bold and monstrous, others soft and slow, disguised as care. Ivy's letter was neither confession nor absolution. It was the echo of a choice, one that had rippled across years and generations. She touched the folded paper once more before continuing home. Sometimes she knew. The things left unsaid were the ones that changed lives most. Mr. Harper, though long retired, retained the neat habits of a solicitor still in service. He received Miss Marple with a quiet nod and offered a glass of elderflower cordial, which she politely declined. Ivy Penfold's affairs, he repeated, fingering a slim notepad. Yes, I handled them. Uncomplicated on the face of it. But she did attempt to revise her will. Once. He tapped the table. It was never signed, left in draft form. Both sons were to be cut out entirely, the cottage placed in trust. Miss Marple raised her brows lightly. Unusual for a woman so concerned with order. Quite, he agreed, and done in haste. She rang me late one evening, insisted on privacy. I found her agitated, far more so than usual. He paused. She spoke of corruption within the home, but refused to elaborate. There were whispers, of course, he added. Gossip travels faster than law. Some said she was being blackmailed, others that she wished to leave everything to a certain child. But that proved unfounded. Miss Marple folded her hands. A child who once lived with her, perhaps? Mr. Harper did not confirm, but neither did he refute. Ivy's conscience, he said finally, was more complex than her will ever was. And Miss Marple, rising gently, understood that not all legacies were written in ink. The Women's Institute Hall, normally filled with the comforting sounds of teacups and choral arrangements, had grown still around the topic of Ivy Penfold. Miss Marple, seated near the cake table, listened as Mrs. Vole, a pale and precise woman, spoke almost to herself. She cried once, she murmured, not looking up. Not in front of anyone, you understand. But I saw her, behind the tea urn, wiping her eyes with her apron. And she said something, soft, like prayer, just a name. Ruth, she whispered. Then, forgive me. There was a hush. Mrs. Vole took a shallow breath and returned to slicing the Victoria sponge. No one pressed her for more. Later, outside beneath the holly bush, Miss Marple reflected on the smallness of the scene. Ivy, not known for displays of emotion, had chosen a hidden moment to weep. And the words she had chosen were not ones of anger or fear, but of remorse. It was the kind of sorrow that did not seek to be witnessed, and thus rang truer than any confession. Miss Marple turned the name over again in her thoughts, like a coin long worn smooth. Ruth. Whatever had happened all those years ago, Ivy had never quite let go. In the following days, Miss Marple observed a curious pattern. Each time the name of the evacuee girl arose, in shops, at the post office, even during a mild debate over gooseberry jam, conversation shifted. It was not denial, nor deliberate concealment. It was redirection. Mrs. Pattle, who never forgot a name nor the date it arrived in the parish, suddenly found her memory failing when Miss Marple asked how long Ruth had stayed with Ivy. "Oh, not long, dear," she said vaguely. "And it was wartime, you know. So many faces, couldn't be expected to recall them all." Even the vicar's wife, usually so forthcoming, hesitated when Miss Marple wondered if Ruth had ever returned for a visit. "I don't believe so," she said slowly. No, I imagine she moved on, as they all did. But it was not the facts themselves that struck Miss Marple. It was the hesitation, the need to deflect, the absence where once there had been chatter. Villagers remembered everything, especially the things they didn't want to say aloud. She folded her gloves slowly after tea, and considered how many cupboards in St. Hermes had closed with unfinished stories inside them, like biscuit tins with their lids sealed tightly, hiding what no one dared to taste. The local library, though modest, maintained a careful archive of parish records and wartime papers. Miss Marple, with the librarian's blessing and a gentle smile, sifted through the year 1943 with gloved fingers and patience. She found it in a column buried beneath wedding announcements and rationing notices. Evacuee child missing for 3 days, returned safe but silent. The article was short. Ruth M. Ellison, aged 9, placed with Miss Ivy Penfold of Rosewood Cottage, went missing the evening of 3rd April. Discovered near the railway embankment, alone and unharmed. No injuries reported. It included only one comment. No charges filed. Circumstances considered sensitive. Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time, noting the absence of Ivy's voice in the article. No direct statement, no image. Just the quiet acknowledgement of something not quite explained. She traced the lines with her eyes, the dates, the tone. The way the child's disappearance had been closed off like a door no one wanted opened again. The language was careful, tidy, but even in print, silence leaves a residue. She folded the article gently, her fingers lingering on the words, "returned safe but silent." Silence, she thought, could sometimes echo louder than screams. As she walked through the churchyard that afternoon, Miss Marple considered the phrase again. No charges filed. A legal conclusion, certainly. But law and truth, she had found, were often only distant cousins. No one had been held accountable. Ruth had vanished, returned, and been forgotten. Publicly, at least. And Ivy Penfold had been allowed to close her doors and carry on baking her honey biscuits. But Miss Marple had seen too many tidy stories wrapped in lace and lavender. She had learned to look not for the declarations, but for the absences. What the article didn't say, and what the village no longer remembered, carried more weight than the clipped report itself. Had Ivy feared scandal, or something more intimate? A shame that could not be named. Miss Marple thought again of the tin, the stained handkerchief, the child's button, the letter never sent. She paused by a bench beneath the yews and sat quietly, the world moving around her. Somewhere in the careful omissions of St. Hermes Hollow, a different kind of wound had formed, one too delicate to stitch and too deep to dismiss. Some stories, she knew, preferred the shadows. But even shadows given time begin to shift. By week's end, the village had returned to its gentle rhythm. Scones at the vicarage, small disputes over bunting placement for Whitsun, and the low hum of summer bees. And yet, Miss Marple noticed how certain names were never repeated, how the air grew stiffer when conversations turned toward the past, not from guilt, but from a practiced comfort in forgetting. She sat in the tea room one morning, watching as the new grocer's boy laughed with Mrs. Goodbody over her parcels. Life moved forward, as it always did. But beneath it, she sensed the unevenness. Ruth's absence had not broken the village. It had simply been folded away, like a cracked plate placed at the back of a cupboard. Ivy's guilt had grown in that space, slow and inward, until it clung to her in private, behind tea-urns and closed parlor doors. The village had not hidden the truth maliciously. It had simply not looked too closely, as if kindness were better served by turning away. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly and looked out the window toward Rosewood Cottage. People forget things, she thought, but they never forget how they forgot. And in that forgetting, the truth often waits, quiet and patient, for someone to lift the lid once more. The knock came early. Too early for bread to have cooled or kettles to have been poured. It echoed against the bakery's blue-painted door with a rhythm too official for neighborly calling. Henry Penfold answered it with flour still on his sleeves. Two uniformed men stood there, their expressions a blend of politeness and obligation. One held a folded note, the other a warrant. "There's been a development," the taller one began, with the voice of someone used to disturbing breakfasts. "We've had a letter, anonymous. It alleges that the item found in the late Miss Penfold's effects, containing blood and a button, relates to an event in 1943, a child's disappearance." Henry blinked, the color draining slowly from his already pale face. What's this to do with me?" The reply was courteous but firm. "You're named Mr. Penfold. The claim states the item was yours, that you placed it there." Within the hour he had been escorted quietly but visibly to the constable's office. No cuffs, no shouting. Just a strange, dreadful stillness. Miss Marple watched from across the green, her knitting stilled in her lap. She noted the way Mrs. Penfold stood in the doorway, not rushing after her husband but simply watching. Her hands were pressed flat against her apron, unmoving. It was not fear that showed on her face, but something curiously absent. By mid-morning, uniformed men were seen on ladders outside the bakehouse, their boots thudding faintly against the old eaves. Her neighbor reported that boxes were being brought down, wrapped in oilskin and layered in dust. By noon, the whisper had taken form. They found something. And that something was a child's satchel, worn, frayed at the corners, and still faintly marked with schoolgirl initials. Inside, a pencil stub, a faded postcard of London, and a loop of pink ribbon tied with clumsy fingers. Miss Marple received the news with quiet gravity from the vicar's wife, who had heard it via Mrs. Larch, who had it from the grocer's boy. "A satchel," the vicar's wife repeated. "Just left there, all these years. Left or hidden." Miss Marple walked the lane later, alone. She thought of Ivy's linen cupboard, the tin beneath the lace, now an attic, long undisturbed, until prodded. Things that remained undisturbed rarely did so by accident. She paused by the low wall at Rosewood Cottage and studied the bakehouse windows. The question, she thought, was not how the satchel came to be there. It was who had put it there, and why they had only begun to panic now. Mrs. Penfold's reaction to her husband's arrest was, by all appearances, entirely appropriate. She sat in the front parlor, accepting visitors with trembling hands and a slightly red nose. But Miss Marple, who had known grief in all its shades, observed something that others did not. Mrs. Penfold's eyes remained too dry for too long. Her voice never cracked. Her hands did not shake as they passed cups of tea. And beneath it all was the strange calm of someone who had already braced for the storm, before the clouds had even gathered. "I don't understand any of it," she said to Miss Marple. "He never spoke of Ruth. Never." Miss Marple, quiet as ever, simply nodded. She had not asked about Henry. "I suppose," Mrs. Penfold added with a weary sigh, "we all forget things." Henry certainly forgot more than he remembered. It was a peculiar statement, less a defense than a conclusion. Not a wife insisting her husband was incapable, but suggesting that if he had done such a thing, even he might not recall it now. Miss Marple took her tea without comment. She had heard confessions before, but never quite so carefully shaped as denial. Word spread that the satchel had been marked, initials faint but legible. T.P. Miss Marple stood beside Constable Finch later that day, peering gently at the article through the glass of the small village station. It was just as described. A child's satchel, its contents undisturbed for decades. But the ink, though faded, was still clear. T.P. not R.E., as one might expect for Ruth Ellison, Thomas Penfold. Miss Marple asked no direct questions. Instead, she inquired gently about old possessions, about wartime belongings, about things that might have been forgotten and found again. The constable, not especially imaginative, shrugged. Could have been anything. Boys played all sorts, shared things. Maybe he gave it to the girl. But Miss Marple remembered the tidy lines of Ivy's confession, the letter in the tin, the tone of a woman who had covered something, not for love, but for fear. If Thomas had given the satchel to Ruth, why had it returned to the attic? And if he hadn't, why had it never been missed? She walked slowly back toward the green, feeling the first chill of truth beneath the surface. What had begun as an old woman's hidden sorrow was beginning to reach back toward a boy, a button, and something he had never quite named. The following afternoon, the tea shop was crowded with a troop of school children rehearsing for their Jubilee tableau. They wore second-hand uniforms, replicas of evacuee dress, with coats too long and ribbons tied with proud inaccuracy. Miss Marple had taken her usual table by the window when Thomas Penfold entered, drawn by habit rather than hunger. He glanced about, nodded politely, and made to retreat, until he caught sight of a girl seated near the door. She wore a blue-gray dress and a yellow tag pinned to her collar. Nothing dramatic, but Thomas stopped as though struck. He did not speak. He simply froze, then turned abruptly and left. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Later outside, she found him lighting a cigarette with unsteady fingers. Table was full, he said, not looking at her. I believe you recognize something, she said gently. Or someone. He shook his head. Costumes, that's all. Play acting. And yet, she said, you left before ordering. He looked at her then. For the first time since his return, his gaze met hers fully, and behind it something hollowed by time. She looked like her. He murmured, Ruth? Miss Marple didn't press. Guilt, she knew, was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived decades late, in the form of a child wearing someone else's memories. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. The village felt suspended, like a breath held too long. Thomas was seen walking at odd hours, his gaze low, his step uncertain. Henry remained under questioning, though no charges had yet been filed. And Miss Marple, seated on her porch, with her knitting, found herself thinking less of the biscuit tin and more of the hands that had once packed it. It was not Ivy's guilt that grew clearer now. It was Thomas's. Not the guilt of a man who had harmed, but of one who had not understood, who had played at war and never grasped the depth of the game. A boy who might have frightened a girl without meaning to, whose mother had chosen silence to shield them both. Miss Marple considered the tin, the button, the handkerchief, the letter. None of it spoke of malice, all of it spoke of fear. Not of what had happened, but of what others might believe had happened. She looked out toward Rosewood Cottage, its garden neatly kept even now. Sometimes, she thought, the past doesn't knock to accuse. It knocks to be answered. And someone, at last, must open the door. It was not Miss Marple's custom to interfere, but she had long since learned that the Ministry of Records responded well to politeness proper stationery, and the gentle implication of long-standing parish duty. Within a week of her discreet inquiry, a single page arrived from London. A relocation summary. Ruth Marguerite Ellison, now recorded as Ruth Markham. No marriage, no children, no known relatives. A note beside the name indicated voluntary name change filed in 1953. The trail was thin but intact. She had lived in Bristol for many years, worked as a seamstress, and according to a brief notation from social services, had received correspondence from a solicitor's office in 1979. No response recorded. Miss Marple folded the page carefully. It was not the information itself that startled her. It was the deliberate silence Ruth had chosen. A child sent away from a village she was told had imagined things. A young woman who had vanished in every way that mattered. What Ruth had experienced in St. Hermes Hollow had not ended with her departure. It had simply changed shape, become the sort of pain that one packs away, tightly, like winter garments, in a case that no one wishes to open again. And yet, here they all were, decades later, surrounded by forgotten tins, dusty cupboards, and wounds wrapped in lace. Some letters, Miss Marple reflected, are never meant to be sent. But that does not mean they are not read. The old vicarage archives held more than service ledgers and organ rosters. In a back room behind rows of outdated psalters and communion cloths, Miss Marple found a modest wooden box marked Miscellaneous. Women's Group, 1940s. It was here that she found it, between the yellowed pages of a dog-eared hymnal, a torn sheet of writing paper folded twice, with the unmistakable slope of Ivy Penfold's hand. The ink had faded, the crease worn soft, yet the words were intact, though incomplete. She said he frightened her, but I told her it was just a game. I said boys did such things, that she was imagining harm because she did not understand play. But I saw her face, I knew. It was not fear of shadows, it was memory of him. The rest had been torn away. Miss Marple sat quietly with the page resting on her lap. There was no overt admission, no naming of acts. But in Ivy's own voice there was the weary cadence of someone who had told herself a lie, often enough to pretend it was kindness. It was the sort of lie that mothers sometimes made, when love and shame collided, and left no simple choice. She folded the paper and slipped it back within the hymnal's cover. In that moment she did not judge Ivy. She merely understood how a woman could sing in church for years, or while carrying a note of sorrow in her pocket. There was one more page in the same hand, this one hidden within the binding of a devotional guide, its edge frayed but legible. It was someone I bore. That was all. No name followed, no explanation. Just that unfinished phrase, left to hover in the empty space between confession and silence. Miss Marple read it 3 times. The ink was smudged near the full stop, as if Ivy's pen had paused, perhaps trembling, perhaps refusing. There were many ways to interpret such a sentence: a literal child, a figurative wound, a guilt handed down as quietly as a pair of gloves. But Miss Marple, who had watched generations grow in front of lace curtains and behind locked doors, knew precisely what the line meant. Ivy had not covered up an act of violence. She had covered up the fear that something done in childhood might one day be misnamed, that her son might be judged by those who did not know the difference between cruelty and ignorance. She had buried her fear, not to deceive but to protect, and in doing so, had given it roots. Miss Marple folded the page with great care. Some sentences, she thought, do not require ending. They only require someone willing to read them aloud. Rosewood Cottage had changed little since Ivy's death. The paint was chipped in places, the hydrangeas overgrown. but the garden paths remained tidy. Miss Marple, welcomed politely by the current tenant's housekeeper, was left alone to inspect the flower beds for cuttings, as she had claimed. The rosebush by the back fence, Queen of Sweden, if she recalled correctly, had always grown a little too proudly for the soil. And now, beneath its pale pink blossoms, she saw what others had not. The earth was turned. Not freshly, but recently. The topsoil had been disturbed and smoothed again, too neatly. No other plant nearby bore the same treatment. She knelt, her hands moving slowly. Beneath the top layer the soil grew dense, and then, caught in a root, a sliver of pink cloth. She paused. The color was not of any rose she knew. She uncovered a corner of fabric, brittle now, and beneath it a rusted object, round-edged, no longer shiny, the clasp of a sash, the kind worn with wartime uniforms, and beside it, the edge of a ribbon bow, just enough to know, not buried with malice, buried like regret, quietly, and without hope of flowering again. Miss Marple did not take the objects with her. She reburied them as they had been left, gently, reverently. Later, seated once more in her parlor, she turned over the image they evoked. A child's sash, a clasp long since dulled, a bow tied by a nervous hand, and someone, likely Ivy herself, placing them beneath a rose bush she tended with such care. There had been no attempt to destroy, only to hide, not with malice, but with aching tenderness. The sash had likely belonged to Ruth, a keepsake, perhaps left behind when she fled, or perhaps taken from her, folded and buried with trembling fingers by a woman who could not bear the weight of what might have been. Miss Marple looked out toward the garden where her own roses swayed gently in the breeze. Ruth had never returned, but her presence had never left. She now understood the biscuit tin, the blood on the cloth, likely from a scraped knee or panicked fall, the button, perhaps torn from a sleeve in fear. Nothing conclusive, but when set beside silence, they had become a verdict, not of guilt, but of pain too great to speak. And yet pain, like roses, always finds a way to push through. Miss Marple made no dramatic announcement, nor summoned anyone to explain themselves. She never needed to. Instead, over tea with the vicar and his wife, she spoke quietly of what she had found. Not in tones of accusation, but of soft certainty. Ivy feared what people might think, she said. And in her fear, she did not trust the village to distinguish between childish confusion and adult wickedness. And so she kept it hidden, for Thomas and for herself. The vicar's wife dabbed at her eye. The vicar nodded solemnly. And Ruth? She bore the silence differently, Miss Marple said. She carried it alone. Perhaps it grew heavier with time. Or perhaps she simply chose not to look back. The letter, the satchel, the clasp, all these had formed a picture. Not of crime, but of consequence. Miss Marple had seen it before. The damage done not by what had happened, but by the things people had feared had happened, by the words they never dared to say. Now she let the story settle. A quiet story, composed of incomplete sentences and fading ink. And yet the truth had emerged, not to punish but to clarify. She poured another cup of tea. Some mysteries, she thought, do not need solving, only understanding. It was an afternoon like any other in St. Hermes Hollow. Cloudy still, the scent of lilac just beginning to rise in the hedges. And yet, her quiet gravity lingered beneath the ordinary, drawn together by Miss Marple's soft-spoken request. The vicar's parlor had been prepared with care. No accusation, no spectacle, merely a room of chairs and teacups, and those who had, knowingly or not, kept the threads of a story, knotted too long. Thomas and Henry Penfold sat apart, the latter stiff with resentment, the former pale but composed. Mrs. Penfold clutched her handbag as though it might unravel. Constable Finch perched uncertainly on the edge of a floral armchair. And the vicar stood, hands loosely folded, not presiding but attending. Miss Marple, never theatrical, spoke gently. "I thought it time we spoke plainly. No one is here to judge, only to understand." A hush followed, not tense but expectant. She looked to each of them in turn. "There has been a great deal of confusion, and some quiet suffering. The truth, I believe, is far simpler and far sadder than it first appeared." She folded her hands and began, as she always did, not with blame, but with memory. "In 1943, Miss Marple said evenly, a young girl was placed in Miss Ivy Penfold's care. Ruth Ellison, an evacuee from London. Her stay was brief, scarcely 3 weeks. She vanished one afternoon, was found 3 days later by the railway line and sent home without comment or farewell." She paused. No explanation was given at the time, only a whisper that she had imagined things. Thomas stirred in his chair but said nothing. "She had not imagined them," Miss Marple continued. "What happened was not violent, but it was frightening. A game played by a boy who did not understand its effect. A soldier's game, one of mimicry and make-believe." She looked toward Thomas. "You wore a cap. You tied her wrists with a sash. You told her not to speak, perhaps in jest. But to Ruth, it was not a game. It was fear. And she carried that fear with her, all her life." Thomas's voice, when it came, was quiet. "I don't remember. I only remember her crying." Miss Marple nodded. "And your mother, faced with what she feared would become scandal, told Ruth she had imagined it, that she was foolish. She sent her away." A silence followed, deeper than any before. "Ivy did not act out of cruelty," Miss Marple said softly. "She acted out of fear. She feared what others would think, that her son, young, impressionable, a boy who played too convincingly, would be accused of something dreadful." She turned her gaze toward Mrs. Penfold. "She chose silence, and that silence became her burden." The room was still. Henry's face had hardened, not from anger but from the slow shock of recognition. "She never said anything," he murmured. "Not a word." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But she carried it. You saw it in her garden, her precise habits, her sudden temper. And in the biscuit tin. She preserved that memory, not to remind herself of wrongdoing, but to punish herself for her silence." The vicar lowered his head, whispering a short prayer. Mrs. Penfold dabbed at her eyes, though they had not wept until now. "She tried to write to Ruth," Miss Marple continued, "but never sent the letter. Perhaps she hoped one day to explain, or perhaps she knew she never could." The weight of the unsaid had not lifted. It merely sat more gently now, understood, acknowledged, its shape outlined for the first time. Some mothers lie to protect, but they do not forget. Miss Marple reached into her reticule and unfolded the small envelope containing the silver button. "This," she said, placing it on the table between them, "was once stitched to a child's play uniform. Not standard issue. A gift, perhaps. A treasure. Something worn in innocence. Yet here it became something else." She looked toward Thomas, who stared at the button as if it might vanish. "You wore it when you played soldier, a game no one supervised. Ivy let you play in the garden, and you roamed farther than she knew." Thomas said nothing. "The handkerchief," Miss Marple continued, "was likely used to bind Ruth's hands, or perhaps to quiet her cries. It was bloodied, but not from injury. It carried the traces of panic. A scraped knee, a child running too fast in fright. Constable Finch shifted uncomfortably. "These were not weapons," she said gently. "But they became, in memory, symbols of something much larger. Ivy placed them in the tin not to preserve a crime, but to confess a failure." She paused, allowing the words to settle. They were her penance. She wrapped them in lace, hid them in the back of the cupboard. She could not face them, but she could not throw them away. Thomas finally whispered, "I thought she'd burned it all." "I hope she had." "No," Miss Marple said. "She kept it, because part of her knew you never truly forget what you bury." And then, more softly, "Not if you love the one you're burying it for." "The satchel," Miss Marple went on, "was found in the attic of the bakery, hidden behind crates that hadn't been moved in decades. Inside, initials. TP. She looked to Thomas once more. "You saw the tin after your return. You realized what it meant, what your mother had kept and what it might reveal. You panicked." Thomas nodded just once. "I didn't think," he said quietly. "I found the satchel in the cupboard. She must have put it there years ago. I thought, if someone found it, they'd assume—" His voice faltered. Miss Marple didn't press. "You brought it to the bakery, hid it, out of fear." He nodded again. Henry's voice, dry and low, broke in. "And I was arrested." "I never meant for that," Thomas said, not looking up. I couldn't breathe, knowing it was still there." Miss Marple inclined her head. "We act clumsily when memory catches us unawares, especially if we've told ourselves we had forgotten." She turned to the constable. "No charges need be filed." And to the vicar she said gently, "But perhaps some healing may begin." The room, though filled with silence, no longer felt heavy. It felt like air returning after too long without breath. Miss Marple took her teacup at last, letting the warmth of it fill her hands. "There is no crime to punish," she said. "Only pain to acknowledge. A game misunderstood, a fear unspoken, a silence kept too long." Henry looked down, his jaw still tight. "People will talk." Miss Marple offered a quiet smile. "People always talk, but they forget too. What they remember is the way someone bears themselves afterward." She turned again to Thomas. "You were a child, and Ruth, a child too. You frightened her. But your mother frightened her more when she told her she was wrong to be afraid." Thomas blinked rapidly and looked toward the hearth. Mrs. Penfold reached for his hand. Not with affection, but with something like shared wariness. The vicar said nothing, but placed a small Bible on the table between them. Miss Marple looked around the room. Ivy Penfold loved her son. She loved him in the way that made her choose silence over truth. That was her mistake. But it was also her love. The constable stood, uncertain. "So, it's finished?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "But it's begun." And with that, she took her shawl, offered thanks for the tea, and left them to the quiet. There are some truths that do not demand justice, only understanding and time. The clink of pruning shears sounded gently through the garden, their rhythm unhurried and meditative. Miss Marple, in her wide-brimmed straw hat, worked steadily along the old rose bed, where the blooms, pale cream, soft pink, and a daring velvet red, nodded as though approving her return. It was a still morning in St. Hermes Hollow. The sort of morning where nothing seemed pressing, and everything could wait until after tea. No child's satchel sat hidden beneath these bushes now. No tin lined with secrets. Only roots and thorns and soil, turned just as it ought to be, to let the roses breathe. She paused by the peace rose, lightly touching a leaf bruised at the edge. The garden, like the village, had been disturbed. Subtly, perhaps, but undeniably. And now, in its own slow way, it was beginning to settle. She moved to the next bloom without remark, the silence companionable, rather than empty. Word had travelled, as it always did in places like St. Hermes, with quiet certainty. Thomas Penfold had taken the early train to London, not hurriedly, no shameful flurry of departure, but quietly, deliberately, with a single suitcase, and a look, some said, that had more resolve than fear. It was the postmistress who mentioned the letter. She had seen him pause before the box outside the station, his fingers in his coat pocket, unmoving. But whether he posted it, no one could say. Miss Marple had her own thoughts on the matter. She imagined the letter, creased from long hesitation, addressed in an unsure hand. To Ruth, perhaps, or to the woman Ruth had become. A letter of explanation, or maybe apology, or maybe not. Perhaps just memory, offered like an olive branch. He might post it, or he might not. But the fact that he carried it at all, that he wrote it, folded it, and tucked it into his pocket, spoke of a kind of movement. Not a journey finished, but one begun. And in Miss Marple's experience, that was often all one could truly ask for. The rest, she had found, had a way of unfolding, if left gently to time. Later, beneath the willow at the vicarage, Miss Marple sipped her tea as the vicar's wife poured another cup, with her usual mild efficiency. The hush of the garden stretched around them, broken only by the soft murmur of bees and the occasional warble of a thrush in the hedge. "He's gone, then," said the vicar's wife, without needing to say who. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but not in flight, more like retreat, the kind that allows one to breathe again. There was a thoughtful pause. Then Miss Marple added, "Not all wounds bleed, you know, and not all truths demand announcing." The vicar's wife studied her own cup. Number some wait for the right ears. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And some for the right silence. They sat together a moment longer, not speaking. The truth had been spoken in its way. And now there was room again for quiet, for peace, if not perfection, and for roses to bloom. And so, as the garden returns to its quiet rhythm, and the past folds itself gently back into the soil, we leave Miss Marple once more among her roses. Ever watchful, ever understanding. Some mysteries, as she knows too well, are not solved with arrests or headlines, but with listening, patience, and the rare courage to see things as they truly are. This was not a case of crime in the usual sense, but of silence, memory, and the long, uneven path toward healing. A forgotten girl, a frightened boy, and a mother who tried to protect too much, too quietly. And yet even here, where wounds were hidden beneath politeness and soil, truth found its way to bloom. Miss Marple reminds us that not all wounds bleed, not all wrongs are punished, and not all endings are tied in neat little bows. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let others find their own way. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.